Can you
Yeah,
see that okay?
yeah, the
Is it
screen.
showing as a slideshow? That's
Mm-hmm.
the other thing I'm not sure of. Can you see it's a slideshow?
No, it's not works. I know that it's sometimes have Zooms have these problems. Adrian yesterday they have slideshows. Maybe with as just without slideshow, just slides. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well,
Okay. Trouble is,
changing it like this.
I have some animation, so it's going to have to go into the place where the slideshows are. Apologies for the
Mm-hmm. Okay.
problem. Let's see if this works if I do it from here. Can't see that. It's because I've got two screens. That's the complication, I think.
Yeah. Mhm. Okay.
See if that works. No. Yeah, this is frustrating. How does this work?
Oh, I think it will be okay if we have a list of slides on our screen. It's not so mm,
Are you sure?
bad. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, it's just that there are some things that you won't be able to see if I do that. I'll tell you what I'll do. If you just give me 1 second, what I'm going to do is I'm going to unplug one of my screens. I think that's going to be the easiest thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay.
bear with me 1 second. I'll unplug it. Okay, do you see it now?
Oh yes, it's now works.
Brilliant, that's good. Just the easier solution, just unplug the computer screen. And it
Yeah.
Okay, well, sorry about that, but thank you for being patient. It's a pleasure to be able to tell you about some of my research that I've been involved in over the past few years. So just to give you a bit of a context, I'm an invasion ecologist. I mainly study the ecology of introduced and invasive plants in various different systems around the world. But I've been in particular working on the macroecology of introduced and invasive species. And the lecture I'm giving you today is made up of two lectures that I give to some of our third year biology students here at Durham. Okay, so we all know that we live in a very interconnected world. All you have to do is look at a map like the one shown of all of the world's flight paths that connect up continents and cities around the globe like never before. Because of this increase in the level of connectivity between continents, between regions, between cities, through trade and transport, we are potentially moving species around the globe in levels that we've never seen in the past. Okay, and it's not just aviation that's really taken off and is connecting the world in the 21st century, but also shipping. And shipping is particularly important just because of the sheer volumes of trade that occur via large container ships, such as the one that's shown in the photo there. So this is the MSC Arena, and it was first floated in November 2022, so quite recently, and it can carry well over 24,000 20-foot equivalent container units. So huge volumes of trade being transported around the world and potentially harboring species that will be intentionally or unintentionally introduced to a new part of the world. And just again, to give you some idea of the size of these ships, this was a former world record holder, the HMM Algeciras. It's almost as tall as the Empire State Building if you stood it up from one end to the other. So very big ships, very big volumes of trade, very large potential for introducing species to new parts of the world. So humans are really breaking down biogeographic barriers that have been there for millions and millions of years and have led to unique biotas on different continents across the globe. And so we can think of species as being native to a particular continent, so shown on the left-hand side in this cartoon figure. And through shipping, not necessarily pirates, we're introducing species such as new ornamental plants to a new continent, say from North America to Europe. And at which stage we would say those plants that survive, once we introduce them, they are called introduced, sometimes alien, sometimes exotic. These terms are used interchangeably in invasion ecology. And of course, you've got your own set of natives in that receiving continent where the introduced species ends up. Now, over time, many of those introduced plants, they're just going to sit in people's gardens. They're not really going to do very well or manage to reproduce or establish new adults. But a small proportion of those species that we do introduce will be able to reproduce, create new adults, recruiting them into their populations. And at that stage, we say that they are self-sustaining. Okay, they don't depend upon the human introductions anymore. They are established or naturalized. And it may be that some of them are so successful and increase in abundance and in the range size in the introduced continent, perhaps to the detriment of native plant communities and species, at which point we would say the species has become invasive. And a lot of my research is really focused on trying to understand what is it about those invasive species that makes them so successful, the small percentage that actually make it and go on to sometimes dominate native communities where they invade. So that's the idea of invasions as a process, a bit of terminology, and the fact that we're breaking down biogeographic barriers, and that's leading to this process of invasion at a rate that we've never really seen before. And so that raises some really big questions within the field of invasion ecology. Zooming out to the whole globe, we might be interested in knowing what is the global picture of introduced and invasive species richness. So are there certain places that tend to be hotspots with many species that are establishing after introduction, and why might that be? So we might be interested in knowing what the underlying processes are behind those patterns. Then we might want to know how those patterns of introduction and invasion over time are changing, and how exactly. And this may be linked to changes in the source pools where species are being introduced from, largely as a consequence of shifts in global trading patterns. And then a final question, which I'm not going to talk about today, is globally, what really characterizes invasiveness? Is there a suite of traits that really characterize a lot of invasive species around the world, which we could then use to try and predict and prevent invasions in the future? But what I'm going to do in today's lecture is really focus on those first three questions on the slide. And in order to address those questions, we really need to have big global databases cataloging species introductions and species establishment events. And so that's why myself, it wasn't just me, it was a team of European invasion ecologists decided to build the world's first comprehensive database of naturalized alien or introduced plants. It's known as GLONAF, it's the Global Naturalized Alien Flora. We came up with this idea back in 2011 while sat in Leipzig in Germany, a whole group of us, and the idea was born. And then around about 2014, 2015, we finally had the first version of this comprehensive database. And in this database, we've got something like more than 13,000 plant species that are known to be naturalized somewhere in the world outside of where they are native. And you can see the team shown in a photo there in 2018 on the top right. And the key figure, the figure of the globe that you can see in the middle, is the main kind of take-home figure from that first version of the database, showing where in the world tends to have more naturalized plant species. Okay, and those are the hotter colors that you can see. And if you want to know more, feel free to check out our website, www.glonaf.org, to find out more about our publications and some of the key research findings that we've come up with over the years. So we found with this database that there are more than 13,000 introduced plant species that are naturalized somewhere in the world outside of their known native range. And if you think about it, there are around about 400,000 plant species on the whole planet that we know about, that are described. So that represents around 4% of the world flora that are naturalized somewhere on the planet. And in terms of the key hotspots, you can see that they tend to be coastal regions, so the eastern and western seaboards of North America, England in particular, also Britain in general. We like to do lots of gardening, so you can imagine there are many introduced ornamental plants in the UK. And then China is also, sorry, not China, Japan is also a hotspot, as is New Zealand. And just over here on the left, you can't see it so clearly. There's a cluster here of hotspot islands. That's Hawaii, well known for having many invasive plant species. So we were interested in trying to understand those global patterns a bit more. So what are the latitudinal patterns like? And it's well known within macroecology for native species that there tends to be a peak in native species richness in the tropics. And there are various hypotheses that I won't go into as to why that might be the case. And so we were interested in knowing how much introduced naturalized plant species deviated from that pattern. And in the top right-hand figure here, you can see the number of native plant species in regions in relation to latitude, correcting for the area of different regions. And you can see that hump-shaped relationship quite nicely on continents with peak richness at around about the equator. But if we look at the alien or the introduced plant species, we see there's a bit of a dip in the equator. So it seems that once we correct for area, in the tropics, we tend to have fewer introduced plant species compared to in the temperate regions either side of the equatorial belt. And then if we calculate the number of introduced plant species that there are relative to natives, so this invasion level here shown in the bottom right-hand figure, you can see that dip is more pronounced. So obviously the tropics are very species rich with natives. The number of non-natives, the introduced plants, is far lower by comparison in the tropics compared to the temperate regions. So it does seem to be that the tropics are less invaded, if you like. There are fewer introduced and naturalized plant species. And you might think, well, why is that? Is it because tropical forests or tropical communities are particularly resistant to introductions and invasions? Or is it maybe just because fewer species are introduced in the first place? And it's possible that it maybe is that second answer. Because again, if you look at the flight map of the world, and you can see similar maps for shipping traffic, for container ships moving across the world, there's a lot of linkage in the north, across the temperate region of the north, and there's some from northern to southern temperate regions as well. But if you look at the equatorial belt, the tropical belt, there doesn't seem to be that much in the way of flights connecting tropical America with tropical Africa, for example. And it would be the same for shipping routes. And so that really suggests that it's the fact that we're introducing fewer species that then means there are fewer invasive species in the end in the tropics. Although you'd need to do some extra analyses and some experiments perhaps to look at how resistant tropical systems are to invasion to really verify that. But that would be my hypothesis, is that there's just not enough trade in the tropics to drive invasive species to the high numbers that we see in temperate regions. So then if we look more closely at those global flows of naturalized plants, we know where they're from, where they're native to, using, again, database information, such as that from Kew. And we know where they've become naturalized after being introduced. So a key question that we wanted to try and answer with the GLONASS database was which continents are the biggest exporters of species and which ones are the biggest importers. And the continents that we're talking about are the ones that are shown in the top right-hand figure in different colors: North America, South America, Africa, Europe, temperate tropical Asia, Australasia, and the Pacific Islands. We're not counting Antarctica because, of course, there aren't very many plant species from or being introduced to Antarctica. Believe it or not, there are actually some naturalizing plants in Antarctica, but they're very few in number. So if we think about the most species-rich regions of the world for plants, South America is widely considered to be the most species-rich continent in terms of plants. So just based on species richness estimates alone, we would naturally expect South America to be the biggest exporter to other parts of the world. And that's what's shown in this circle diagram here. It's slightly complicated, but the main thing to bear in mind is that as we go from this side clockwise around, we're going from net donors around to net recipients of naturalized species. And this is based on a null expectation that we're just randomly selecting species from the global flora and then introducing them somewhere in the world. If you think of that null expectation, if we were to do that, then there are more species in South America, so more South American species would naturally be introduced and naturalized elsewhere. Is that what we really find in reality? No, it actually isn't. This is the pattern that we find in reality from the GLONASS database. So you can see that the top donor is temperate Asia, followed by Europe. And the net recipients are Australasia and the Pacific Islands. Those are the two biggest recipient continents or regions of the globe. And so the question is why? Why is temperate Asia at the top, followed by Europe? Well, for Europe, it may be quite straightforward. There's probably a strong signal here of European colonialism. So Europeans not only moving themselves to other parts of the world a few centuries ago and up until relatively recently, also they were taking plants with them, or I should say we, the British, did this in particular across the globe, introducing species in large numbers for trade, for economic reasons, and unintentionally as well. So that might explain why Europe is number 2 as a net exporter of species. Temperate Asia is slightly more complicated, but there are several reasons. One is temperate Asia economically is in more recent decades pretty important on a global scale. So you'd expect there to be more exports of plants from temperate Asia in more recent decades. However, these patterns are accumulated over long periods of time. Okay, this is going back several centuries we're talking about with the introductions in this database, as well as more recent ones. And so it might actually be a consequence of the large area of temperate Asia. Because if you've got a large area, a large continent, the ranges of species, the native ranges, are going to be potentially large in that continent as well. And so that just increases the chances of picking up any one species and introducing it somewhere else, intentionally or unintentionally. What about other taxonomic groups? We focused on plants in the GLONASS database, and we were really interested in trying to understand whether you see the same patterns or different patterns, and if you saw different patterns with other taxonomic groups, what might underlie those differences. So I combined the GLONASS database with 7 other taxonomic groups. So we looked at introduced and invasive birds using the Global Avian Invasions Atlas. We looked at reptiles and amphibians. We also looked at ants using the Ant Maps database. We looked at mammals with colleagues based in Australia. Amphibians, as I just mentioned, it was the same data set as the reptiles. And then we used Fishbase and the US Geological Survey databases to put together a set or a data set of introduced and establishing fish. And I should say these are freshwater fish rather than marine ones. And then finally, we looked at spiders using the World Spider Catalogue. So do we see the same patterns for plants as we do for these other taxonomic groups? Well, in order to really bring these databases to integrate them together, we had to think about the kind of spatial framework that we use for the whole globe, because they all have different spatial systems that they've used to catalogue where species are introduced and established for those different taxonomic groups. So I used what's called the Taxonomic Database Working Group framework, and a summary of the finer scale regions within that framework as shown in this map here. And it includes 609 geopolitical regions nested in 52 subcontinental and then 9 continental regions, which you've already been introduced to. And that really allowed me to work out the established introduced richness for the same spatial units for those different taxonomic groups. And then that allowed us to compare them properly and look at them on aggregate, on average. Okay, so this map or this figure really summarizes the results, the species richness for those 8 different taxonomic groups. And we'll go through some of the correlations in a moment. But you can see that for plants, again, we've got North America, parts of Europe, Australia figuring quite highly. And then we've got spiders here, we've got Florida, California, Hawaii, and New Zealand. The Northern Island of New Zealand is quite a hot spot. But then if we look at reptiles, the data are not so good, but Florida pops out as a hot spot. And then if we look at ants, again, Florida pops out as a hot spot. And in all of them, Hawaii tends to be, again, a hot spot for all of the taxonomic groups. Okay. So if we look at the correlations among those taxonomic groups, these are just Pearson's correlation coefficients between those different taxa. Ones to really focus on are the ones in dark red. So we can see that we've got quite a strong correlation between ant and reptile richness. Another one between plants and spiders, shown here. And then another strong correlation between birds and mammals. And there could be different reasons for these strong correlations. It might be that for birds and mammals, historically, there were groups of people known as acclimatization societies in places like North America and in Australasia, who are very keen on introducing the birds and mammals of Europe to make it feel like home to those new parts of the world. And so that might explain why birds and mammals are strongly correlated. Ants and spiders, we'll come to that in a moment, and also ants and reptiles. So what I did to try and get an average, an aggregate across those taxonomic groups, was just to work out the relative richness per taxon, so relative to the maximum richness for that particular taxonomic group, and then calculated those relative richnesses as an average, so just average them. And then I used a linear model to account for area and sampling effort, and looked at the residuals in percentile categories, okay, to really highlight where the hotspots on aggregate across taxonomic groups were across the globe. So you can see the upper 2.5% of regions in red and the lower 2.5% of regions in dark blue. Of course, Antarctica and Greenland, they're not only cold, but they're also cold spots in terms of introduced and invasive species across those taxa. Whereas Italy, Florida, California, Hawaii, New Zealand, and some of the Mascarene Islands here, just at the east of Madagascar, also show up as hotspots. So it looks like, again, we've got this pattern on average of islands being hotspots and potentially coastal regions. Why are some regions hotspots? Well, one of them might be because they're islands. Okay, so islands, particularly more remote ones, they might have higher rates of introduction. because we need to introduce more useful species to people than areas that are closer to mainland, because there aren't so many native species and there may not be so many useful native species within the flora and fauna. So we may be introducing them. It could be that because you've got this disharmonious, non-random subset of species that are able to get to these islands, particularly remote ones, that there are many what we call vacant niches. So many patches of resource or types of environmental condition that the natives are unable to use or occupy those niches, and the non-natives are able to do so. It may be that you're missing things like predators, for example, which is a really important thing on islands, that are then able to prey on the vulnerable prey organisms that are native. It may be that coastal regions, mainland coastal regions, have many ports. They may also have higher population densities. So this might explain why Florida, California tend to have higher introduced species numbers. But it may be that there's a separate effect from being coastal, so GDP per capita as a measure of trade, and then also population density, perhaps as a measure of human activity and disturbance, which might promote invasions, may both lead to there being higher numbers of naturalizing species. They may also contribute to higher colonization pressure, so a larger number of species being introduced in the first place. Then there's sampling effort, which is a bit complicated. So if you think about it, every country or every region in the world has a native species inventory. You know what the species are that occur within your own country. But our surveying of them out in the fields, the number of occurrence records that we have may be very patchy. We may not have a complete record in terms of sampling effort. And we can get at that by using something like the Global Biodiversity Information Facility in order to understand how complete native species richness records are based on those occurrences compared to our native inventories. And we can use that as a proxy for how well we've sampled the introduced species. So it may be that places like Britain, that's got a very long history of recording plants, native plants in the field, we've got a more or less complete record of where species are that are in our native inventory. We may also, as a result, have recorded the introduced species well too. Then we've got mean annual temperature and precipitation. They're both known to be important drivers of that native richness latitude relationship that we looked at before. And it could be that they also play a role in determining the number of naturalized species present. So just to show you the first results of trying to answer that question, why are some regions hotspots? I'm going to show you a pretty yucky table. The key thing to take home from these numbers is that they're effect sizes, okay? Not the ones in brackets, but the ones outside of brackets. Those are effect sizes. So they're like the slopes of a regression line in a linear model. I just want to highlight a few of these figures for you, so I'll talk you through it. So the first key finding was that, yes, indeed, islands and coastal regions tend to have more introduced established species. So if we look across all regions, whether mainland or island, the mainland ones, they tend to have fewer species present that are naturalized, okay? If we look at just the mainland regions, this number here is positive. That indicates that coastal regions compared to landlocked regions tend to have more established species as well. So we've got an island effect confirmed, and we've got this coastal versus inland effect as well. And remember, this is after taking into account in a model things like GDP per capita and population density, but those are also important on their own in a positive way. So the bigger the GDP and the more dense the human population, looking across all regions, we have more species that are introduced and establishing. We also see it when we look separately at mainland regions, but if you notice the size of these numbers, they're larger for the island regions. So that suggests we've got a stronger, steeper relationship between GDP per capita, population density, and established species richness for islands. Okay, the effect of increasing GDP or population density by 1 unit is greater for islands than it is for mainland regions. It's quite interesting. And then finally, sampling effort also plays a role in conjunction with area. So the bigger the area, of course, the more species, but in addition to that, the more that you sample an area, the better the coverage of sampling of the natives, the more established alien species we tend to be recording. Makes sense, it's logical. But what about looking at the differences among these different taxonomic groups? How do they compare to one another? And this figure really summarizes it quite nicely. So that model that I just showed you, on the model results, I fitted those models to each individual taxonomic group separately. And you can see the icons for the different taxa shown on the left-hand side. And we've got the different variables that are in the model. And on the x-axis, you've just got the size of the effect of those different variables that we looked at. So you notice I've highlighted ants and reptiles here. They were strongly correlated in species richness, as we looked at before. And in lilac here, you've got the effect of mean annual temperature on those two. So it's significantly and strongly positive for both. And this really suggests that in warmer regions, you get more reptiles, you get more ants. And these tend to be thermophilic taxa. Okay, they do well when it's warmer. So that makes sense in terms of their ecology. If you remember, plants and spiders were strongly correlated. If we look at those two together, then we see that it tends to be human population density and also area that's important. And the human population density is the interesting one here. So the more dense the human population, you might think the more gardens there are, the more introductions of plants there are for ornamental purposes. But why might that drive or be related to spiders? Well, spiders are only going to be introduced unintentionally. Okay, so maybe that they're coming in unintentionally through the ornamental plant trade. That's the hypothesis behind this similarity in those results. Okay, so let's try to sum things up a bit where we are at the moment, because that's quite a lot of information about those two key studies. We've shown that islands and coastal regions are alien species hotspots. We've shown that there are stronger relationships with human variables for islands, and that may indicate they're more easily invaded. Taxonomic groups show some correlation, but there's some indication of different patterns of introduction and different drivers acting as well. Okay. One of the things that we haven't done with these analyses is really controlling for the numbers of species that are introduced and that have failed to establish. So it's quite hard with this kind of data to disentangle what's driving introductions versus what's driving the successful establishment of the species. And that requires some more work. Elena, how are we doing for time?
Yeah, you have a time. I think we have 1 hour and you just 40 minutes. As I said, you have 15 minutes more if you need it. And after that, maybe 5 or 10 minutes if will be some questions.
Okay, yeah, should have enough time. Definitely, I'll keep going then. Okay, so I want to shift into a different kind of question now. So one of the questions was, how are species introduction rates changing over time? And there's been some work recently done that I was collaborating on by Hanno Siebens and colleagues, which showed really nicely for a lot of different taxonomic groups across the globe, that the number of species that get first recorded as established somewhere in the world is increasing. The rate is still increasing for a lot of species, a lot of taxa. So if we look at, for example, if we look at invertebrates down here, bottom left, bottom row, second from the left, we can see that we're increasing the rate at which we're recording introduced invertebrates, okay, over time. And we're seeing the same for arthropods in general, for insects, for mollusks, and for other taxonomic groups like algae. More and more species are being introduced. And that's, again, a consequence of this increase in trade. So trade is really triggering trouble in terms of the number of introduced and establishing species worldwide. For some taxonomic groups, we're seeing a different pattern. So if you look at vascular plants, we can see that we're still accumulating species over time that are newly establishing somewhere, but that rate is not going up anymore, okay? It's flattening off. And that probably indicates that over the past couple of centuries, we've been introducing a lot of plants for ornamental purposes, and we may not be discovering more plants to introduce and use as ornamentals in quite the same way as we did during the past. And we can see a similar thing for birds. We're seeing a leveling off here, and also to some extent for reptiles. So maybe for the vertebrates, you look at the mammals, we're even seeing a decline. So we're really not introducing more new mammal species that haven't been recorded as established before, okay? So that's some good news, but for many taxa, we're just seeing this acceleration of introduction and establishment over time. So the next thing I want to focus on is this idea of island remoteness again. We talked a bit about the role that islands play, or rather the fact that they tend to be a hotspot for invasion of different taxonomic groups. We've seen that they tend to harbour more established species than mainland regions. But there's also a potential effect of remoteness, okay? So Hawaii, shown there in the figure, is perhaps the most remote archipelago that one could think of in the world. It has a lot of invasive species. So how is the number of established and invasive species on islands affected by the remoteness? And how does it compare to the number of native species that we find? Well, you may have learned about the theory of island biogeography in your studies. So this could be revision. If not, then this will be new to you. Either way, it doesn't matter, because I'm going to explain some of it to you, and it really underpins some of the patterns that we're seeing in terms of what we might expect to see in terms of the number of species of non-native versus native species on islands, as islands become more distant from mainland regions. So there are two rates that really dictate the number of native species that we see on islands. They are the immigration rate, shown in red, and the extinction rate, shown in blue. So we'll talk mainly about immigration rate, because that's the most relevant for this study. But the rate of extinction on islands is supposed to be lower if you have larger islands. And that's because populations are larger, they're more likely to survive demographic and environmental stochasticity over time, so they can harbour more species than smaller islands as a result. So larger islands, extinction rates are lower, and so you may expect there to be more species on those larger islands. The immigration rate is determined by how remote the island is from the mainland, okay? So islands that are near to mainland regions, there's a higher immigration rate. More species are dispersing and getting to those islands than for islands that are further away, okay? The immigration rate is lower for more remote islands. And it's really the balance between those two things, so how near or far you are and how small or large you are as an island, that then determines how many species you'd expect to find. So if an island is large and near to a mainland region, then you'd expect there to be more species than if it was small and far away, okay? Now for this study, what we're focusing on is on the remoteness, which in theory should be affecting immigration, okay, of natives. But what about the non-natives? So to try and understand how remoteness affects the number of natives versus non-natives, we use data for 257 tropical or subtropical islands, okay? So spread across the tropical belt. And the reason why we did that is because as you go towards the poles, islands tend to be closer to mainland regions. So you've got a confounding of climate with the level of remoteness. So to remove that effect, we just focused on the equatorial belt. We did this across 5 groups. So we did it for plants, ants, cats, reptiles, and birds, okay? And these dots here, they indicate the number of established species for those taxa on the different islands. And so we were interested in understanding the variation in those species richnesses in relation to distance to the nearest mainland. And so for natives, according to island biogeography theory, we'd expect those more distant islands with lower immigration rates to have fewer native species. And that is indeed what we see across all of our taxonomic groups, shown in the middle row. But when we look at the alien established species richness, we see the opposite effect for both plants and for ants, to some extent for mammals and reptiles, but not for birds. Birds is the odd one out. So you can see it's the opposite pattern to what you'd expect under the theory of island biogeography. The more remote islands are, the more established species there are that are present. And so then if you combine those two numbers together, you get the total number of species for those taxonomic groups. And what you can see is that by adding the aliens, you effectively dilute or even completely remove that classic island biogeography expectation. Okay, we no longer have that strong signal from biogeography of islands with the aliens present. Okay. So why is it that we have more species that are alien and establishing on these more distant islands? What drives that pattern? Well, we did do some further work behind the scenes in that particular study. But one theory is that there may be more trade for more remote islands, because as I said before, there are less useful species. We need to import more species for human use. And as a result, because you've got more introductions, you've got more established alien species. But our work has shown that the inward trade, the amount that's being imported into those islands in terms of trade in general, economically, is actually lower for more remote islands than the ones closer to mainland, okay? And data on the birds, we've got data on introductions per se, not just the established species. That data on birds indicates that there's no increase in the number of birds introduced with greater distances. So it doesn't seem to be an effect of increased trade or just introducing more to the more remote islands. There's something about remote islands that may be making them more vulnerable to invasion by those species once they become introduced. Okay. Great. So on my summary slide, I did have enough time. Happy with that. So globally, I've shown that temperate Asia and Europe are major donors of naturalized plants to other continents, okay? And the number of naturalizing plants in the tropics is certainly lower than it is in temperate regions. That may be down to trade. There could also be an effect of biotic resistance. We need to do more studies on the ground in the tropics to really understand that better. If we look across taxonomic groups, the hotspots for establishing species tend to be islands, coastal regions, and areas that oh, yeah, you stop recording just at the right time because I've just finished.
Yeah, it's just a little problem with my internet, and I was gone on the 5 maybe to a few minutes, and so when as I understand, you're finished today. Yes, your lectures. And okay, thank you very much. It's was exciting, actually, you know. And while I was listening, you know, I have one idea about the tropic regions. Why so a little list of species is realized there. I think it's maybe one of the possible reasons is that the ecological niche is very, very different, and almost all is have its own species, and that's why so many species, so many relations and with the species, and it's just not a new new niche for the another species who's invasive, and invasive species from other regions is not so appropriate to the conditions to the tropics, and natural species is more is more suits for these conditions. Maybe it's one of the reasons, because they have a big diversity, biodiversity, and in other, for example, in the islands, we have many empty ecological niche, and we have places there can be some invasive species live. So thank you very much, and I have a question for my colleagues or my students. Шановні колеги, шановні студенти, можливо, в когось є запитання до пана Вейна? Якщо у вас є запитання.
Yes, I have question. Hello, Wayne. Thank you very much for your interesting lecture. My question deals with the strategy of invasive plants. If we talk about invasive plants, only plants, what can you say about there is one strategy or abundance of different strategies to have success for invasive plants? Which traits and properties allow plant to be successful to occupy territory? And to your mind, what is the best strategy, to your mind, what is the best strategy to be successful as invasive plant in during very, very short time?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I think my answer would be it depends. And I think the reason why it can depend is because every community is different, every ecosystem is different. So it may be a different suite of traits for different locations that determines whether a species is successful or not. But one of the key patterns that we have found over several decades now of studying invasion ecology of invasive plants is that when we're talking about areas that tend to be relatively disturbed, open habitats, it's really those what we call R-selected species with R-selected traits that do very well. So there's been classic work for woody plants that's shown that it's ones that tend to have an early age to sexual reproduction, that have short periods between mast years when they make many seeds, and then also that have fast relative growth rates that really enable them, and small seed size as well is important, that really enable them, that suite of traits around reproduction and growth that really determines the success of introduced plants in more disturbed open habitats. That, of course, doesn't mean that undisturbed habitats cannot be invaded. It may be that we just haven't introduced the right species with the right traits yet. And there is some evidence to suggest from various locations, including in North American forests, that there are some plants that are able to invade understories of relatively undisturbed forest. So holly, Ilex aquifolium, is one species that does very well in North American forests. It's shade tolerant with those tough, leathery leaves. it's able to tolerate the shade and get established in those forests. And so maybe that's because there aren't that many evergreen shrub species in their understories to compete with, for example. So yeah, that's why I think it can depend. And it's a similar thing with the tropics. You see, if we start moving, say, South American tropical plant species to African forests, then I suspect that if we did it completely randomly, there will be a set of species that are able to establish. And there are also some South American tree species that are establishing and spreading in African rainforests. So, you know, it really depends on the context to some degree, but those are selected traits and disturbed areas are key. Sorry, that was a very long question.
Thank you. My proposition, maybe the next your lecture will be about the strategies of the plants.
Sure, I'd love to do that. I'd be very happy to do that. I've got one on the shelf.
Okay, thank you. Any another questions? Шановні колеги, студенти, чи є ще в когось запитання до нашого сьогоднішнього лектора? Okay, I see. Maybe this questions is ended. Okay, Wayne, thank you very much. It was very informative. It was very interesting, and it was very useful for all of us to hear about your work, to hear about invasive species, and maybe to take closely attention on this particular question of about our biodiversity and how it changed in time, and how it can be maybe control it. It's not improve this process, but control it, maybe more control it by people, because we all know that sometimes the invasive species is more successful in these regions, and we lose our natural species due to these reasons. So Wayne, thank you very much.